The joint state-announced sanctions regime the 1 week how are designed to make the largest harm probable to the by the government of CEO Nicolás Maduro, the oil segment and its country business, PDVSA. Up before now White's building execution orders were just targeting by the government officials and specific sectors of the economics. Now new sanctions regime will eventually wound the one segment how is accountable for more than rather than 90% of the by the government's rental income. Lot eminent contracts are yet anticipated to be honored in the upcoming days, but new deals in PDVSA are creature exposed to restrictions. Of April sanctions regime are anticipated to boot in. A new stage in the Venezuela meltdown begun recent monthly while Washington recognized opposition lead Juan Guaido, who is the lead of the domestic gathering, as the legitimate chief of country. Venezuela's convention, that has been undressed of largest of its powers by the government, says Mr. Maduro is a invader. Washington has embarked on an outdoor campaigning in Mr. Guaido to displace Mr. Maduro. The White's building is hard to do a hard item, to do oil rental income immediately achieve common Venezuelans and circumvent the by the government of Mr. Maduro, that owns largest of the oil production via PDVSA. Sanctions regime are intended to displace Mr. Maduro and conduct 2 new elections in Venezuela. U.S. Domestic Safety Advisor John Bolton says the U.S. wants oil income to achieve Mr. Guaido, giver his domestic gathering several economical force to fight Mr. Maduro. One of the ways of making so is via PDVSA-owned refineries relying in Texas, via a affiliate named Citgo. Mr. Bolton has already met Citgo management team and down there is enforced to changing its control in management team equipped by Mr. Guaido's domestic gathering. In impact the opposition is hard to set up a concurrent by the government to Mr. Maduro's in its own office. Mr. Bolton told the sanctions regime would unit $7 bn, pound, in PDVSA's holdings and more than rather than $11 bn in lose exportable revenue above the following year. At the phase, in Venezuela's oil exit on a down helical and the nation cladding harsh shortages, sanctions regime include the force to be disastrous for Venezuelan finance, says Helimo Plot of RBS Equity Markets. But several analysts trust Mr. Maduro yet has a few options. This oil how Venezuela now supply to the U.S. will be diverted to some countries and sold out at reduced prices. For countries love China and India, the news story was related to Dark Monday. They will be capable to choose up these oil volumes at large sale, writes Venezuelan-born analysis Paula Rodriguez Macio, of Rastad Power. She adds how the effect of sanctions regime will be significantly reduced rather than the ones forecasted by Washington. Venezuela supply to the U.S. on 450,000 barrels of oil per date, a slight by part of its full exit. The is the sum of new oil how will flooding the markets. Venezuela's marketplace stake in the U.S. will be up for grabs, conducive Saudi, Mexico and Iraq oil companies. Mrs. Rodriguez Macio says how so distant, oil markets include substantially shrugged off the new excess as investors include been price in Venezuela's meltdown for a length period. China and Turkey are several of the by the government's major allies but Russia is present seen as the key gamer. Moscow has often stipulated finance lifelines to Caracas at times while the nation was on to person severe default. But it hasn't acted cleanly out of amity. 1. Russia's oil business Rosneft, that himself has been object to U.S. sanctions regime with 2014 since of the Ukraine meltdown, already has a 49% share in Citgo. It as well has several guarantee on Citgo, that tool it could grab monitoring of the refineries in Texas were Venezuela's by the government to run in anxiety. Washington has its own grievances in Russia and it is not lucky on the prospects of Rosneft getting a fulcrum in refineries in Texas. It is not clear if the U.S. can effectively redivert asset of Mr. Maduro to Mr. Guaido. Idris Jazahiri, a specific UN speaker who accountable to the Humane Rights Justice, says the human beings of Venezuela are the ones who will eventually carry the main burden of sanctions regime. Sanctions regime that can conduct to hunger and care shortages are not the reply to the meltdown in Venezuela, he told. Settling an economical and human meltdown is not a basis for the peace community of disputes. Mr. Bolton told on Friday how the U.S. would email human assistance, medical, surgery supplies and dietary supplements for the human beings of Venezuela. But it is not clear if it can effectively bypass the Maduro by the government. These sanctions regime could resent for rather a time, and they rely substantially on a policy decision to the stay off among the opposition and Mr. Maduro. In the history, the U.S. had been indecisive on formidable sanctions regime on Venezuela's oil production since it knows that has the capacity to severely influence residing standards of common human beings, that are already cheap. Now Washington is in unexplored area, since it yet has to job out in part how to do oil rental income and human aid achieve Mr. Guaido and the domestic gathering. The end purpose is to strengthen Mr. Maduro out of force each via a agreed decision or by giver incentives for a war coup. In Mr. Guaido guideline the accusation in protests in Venezuela and a broad band of world supporting, that includes the Europe Association and provincial players love Brazil, Argentina and Colombia. Washington hopes it when TB length up it achieves its goals. But these sanctions regime could be a hazardous gambling. In the history, U.S. activity in Venezuela helping Mr. Maduro, and CEO Hugo Chavez up him, to gathering Venezuelans over a overall foe, giver them a interim increase in popular. How could be the instance currently? As well, the deterioration of residing standards now would be immediately accused by Mr. Maduro on the U.S. Moreover, these actions be the reason how Mr. Maduro has been manufacturing, how Mr. Guaido is a simple marionette of the Americans.